Hi, this is the first lecture of what's ultimately going to be the Blitz through the Ancient Near East. Before we jump right into there, I want to talk a little bit about the problem of historiography. If you aren't familiar with those terms, there's a difference between history and historiography, and I'm going to try to break that open for you a little bit. Most of the time when we think of history, we think of the past as it really happened. Historiography refers to the process of attempting to write about the past. And you see the ultimate issue is, in scholarship, is how does one actually know that they've reconstructed the past as it really happened? And essentially all we have access to is not the past anymore. Once something happens, it's gone forever. All that we ultimately have left over and have access to is testimony about the past, and that's what historiography ultimately is. And Gerhard von Rad was a brilliant German Old Testament scholar, one of the giants of the 20th century. And as many of you may know, or maybe have inferred from some of the reading we've done already, there's a tension between the way the Bible describes events in the past and the way that modern historical critical scholarship has been able to reconstruct the same events. And von Rad saw that as one of the key tensions and theological problems that we have to deal with, is when our modern methods don't allow us to reconstruct events as the Bible says that they happened. And this is what he wrote about that. So this is a fairly well-known quotation for those in Old Testament studies. Von Rad wrote, "These two pictures of Israel's history lie before us, that of modern critical scholarship and that which the faith of Israel constructed. The one is rational objective, with the aid of historical method in presupposing the similarity of all historical occurrence, it constructs a critical picture as it really was in Israel. The other activity is confessionally and personally involved in the events to the point of fervor. Historical investigation searches for a critically assured minimum. The charismatic picture tends towards a theological maximum. The fact that these two views of Israel's history are so divergent is one of the most serious burdens imposed today upon biblical scholarship." So, what is history? Notice von Rad in the mid-20th century associated history as it really happened with what modern critical scholarship was able to reconstruct. That was a naive assumption on his part, and in recent days we've come to realize that really history, in a sense, is a myth. The past is a foreign country, you might say. And what postmodernism has shown us is that we can really only access the past via historiography. And historiography is all about looking at different testimonies from different sources that we have. And then ultimately, the key question that you want to ask yourself as you think through the relationship between faith and history is simply this: whose testimony do you trust? And we're going to try to unpack that a little bit. How do you write history? What are some sources of testimony for reconstructing the past? Well, the Bible, that's been a traditional source, and I'm going to talk about in a minute why the Bible is sometimes not used as a historical source, but other sources would be ancient Near Eastern documents, ancient Near Eastern artifacts that have been found, sociological models, insights from anthropology, any kind of available testimonies are put together and sifted through and looked at in order to reconstruct the past. And what's happened in recent days is many modern scholars have discounted the Bible. So a lot of modern histories of ancient Israel, books that are written, and sometimes it's even just called History of Ancient Palestine now, they don't even use the Bible as a source because they say the Bible is problematic for historical reconstruction because of three factors. Number one, that the Bible has an ideological agenda. In other words, they argue you can't use the Bible for history writing because it's a book that's seeking to convince people about Israel's God, and it makes truth claims about God, and it has an agenda. It's ideological, therefore it can't be trusted for historical reconstruction. By the way, I'm going to say something about all three of these in the next slide. Secondly, Another problem that biblical scholars, or some biblical scholars, have with using the Bible for historical reconstruction is that the biblical books themselves, many of them were written long after the events that they purport to narrate. For example, let's just say that Moses did write Genesis through Deuteronomy. Well, even if he did that, the book of Genesis records events that happened way before Moses. And so what's the basis for saying that the book of Genesis could report the past accurately when it was written so far after those events happened? Then lastly, and this is kind of an interesting one, in recent days, biblical scholarship has really come to appreciate the literary artistry of the Hebrew Bible, the intricate weaving of words and patterns. And in a sense, the higher the degree of appreciation for the Bible's artistry has tended to lessen the belief in the trustworthiness of the Scriptures themselves. So let's evaluate those things. Well, one of the textbooks I used to use for this class, and it's a very good one. If you want to read a history of Israel, I recommend this one. It's by Proven, Long, and Longman. It's called A Biblical History of Israel. They've picked those words on purpose because essentially in the first 100 pages of this book, they argue for the use of the Bible in historical reconstruction. And they take those three arguments, that the Bible's too ideological, and they simply make this important observation, drawing on the work of other historians, is that, yes, the Bible's ideological, absolutely, but guess what? Every other testimony is ideological too, and there's no way there's no other document that doesn't have a degree of ideology embedded in it, precisely because all testimony has a level of interpretation in it. And as soon as you start talking about interpretation, somebody has an ideological spin on the facts as part of their interpretation. So you can't say you can't use the Bible because it's ideological. If you're going to say that, they would say, well, you shouldn't use anything to reconstruct because everything has some level of ideology in it. As far as the Bible being written long after the events it reports, well, again, they say that, yeah, that could be true. But it's not so much about how long after the events the testimony comes from. The key question is, can you trust the testimony? And then somewhat humorously, they observe, well, if we can't trust the Bible because it was written long after the events, why do we think modern histories are reliable when literally written thousands of years after the events? So again, it's not so much how long after the original event a testimony derives from, but again, it's the quality of the testimony. And the key question again is, whose testimony do you trust when you're doing historical reconstruction? And then lastly, the Bible is an artistic masterpiece. They basically say that's a rubbish argument that just because the Bible's well written doesn't mean it's not reliable. And in fact, they just say that's actually a genre issue. Just because modern histories have to be boring and dry and difficult to read doesn't mean in the past you couldn't have literary sophistication and still have authentically true and reliable testimony about the past. So what they argue for, and this would be the position that I'd want to take, is that the Bible does serve as a credible testimony that deserves a place alongside the other sources of testimony used by scholars. So if you read their textbook, what they simply do is they look at all available sources for an event and try to put them into critical dialogue with one another in order to get an idea of what the past could have looked like. So some critical questions that I want you to think about. This next lecture, we're just going to race through the ancient Near East. But as you're thinking about faith and history, and this does come up because people watch the History Channel and the Learning Channel, there's lots of videos where they put scholars from different positions on there, and you need to help people to understand how history is written. So you want to ask yourself is, what role does history play in your understanding of the faith? Does it matter if everything that's in the Bible really happened or not? Ask yourself, what's the minimum in the Bible that must be true? And the way I like to ask it is, if we're going to get into groups, and let's talk about this in our discussion for the coming week, what's the buck or butt naked minimum in the Old Testament that has to be true for Christianity to be valid? And maybe make that the whole Bible. What's the buck or butt naked minimum that has to be true? You really need to decide that, because you don't want to draw a line in the sand anywhere other than that butt naked minimum. So If you have any questions, go ahead and post those, and we'll have a good discussion on faith and history this week. Thanks.